I'm Dave Laird.
I'm Matt Booker.
And I'm Sean Pratt. And I do things like get in a taxi and say, the library, and step on it to the great concavity.
Perfect.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome, Sean. Love that. Welcome to the show, man. Thank you so much for swinging by, here at our library.
Yeah.
And people probably have already recognized your voice if they are, Infinite Jest fans, because you are pretty well known now. We were just talking about for being the voice of the audiobook for Infinite Jest.
56 hours.
56 hours of reading out loud.
Oh,
And it takes a lot of space on your computer as well.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
It's not.
that's true.
Truth be told, it's not the longest book I've ever done.
What?
Really?
The,
What's been longer?
well, let's see. The longest project I've ever done was a 5-volume history of the state of California. That was 150 hours.
What?
Oh, wow.
And then the longest single book I've ever done was a 2-volume biography of Abraham Lincoln that clocked in at about 110 hours. So once you do 110 hours, that was before Infinite Jest. So for me,
So you got
it was like falling off a log.
you got to Infinite Jest. You're like, oh yeah, it's child's play.
Yeah, right.
No problem.
No problem at all.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So this is episode 18 of The Great Concavity, and we're super psyched to have you on, Sean. Just Shad. Been listening to too much CBC 3, I think. Speaking of Canada, but we're excited to talk to you about your experience with this book in terms of what it was like recording it, some of the choices that went into that, and then sort of your experience after the fact. So maybe walk us through a little bit of what it's been like, some sort of coming to the project, and what the fallout of that has been.
Yeah, sure. So how did you want me to start? I mean, fire away. I'm here for you
Just
guys.
start with, did you audition to get this part? And, how long did it take you from the time you auditioned to you record it? We assume you didn't record it all at once. So tell us about, you were an experienced narrator before this. So
Yeah.
how did maybe even back up a little bit and tell us how you got into narrating audiobooks and then, then lead into this particular book.
No, sure.
Yeah.
Let's see. I got exposed to audiobooks as a possible profession thing back in 1994. Well, when I went to New York in 90 after getting out of college, all I wanted to do was classical theater. And so when I got there, I started working doing regional theater around the country, and I also eventually became a member of the Pearl Theater, which is an off-Broadway classical theater that had its own acting company. So for about 5 years, I was the resident male juvenile in the company doing all the young prince roles and stuff. And that eventually led me down to Washington, D.C., to the Shakespeare Theater at the Landsberg, which is a big regional theater. And I was playing some parts in Henry IV, Parts 1 and 2. And that's where I met my wife. We played opposite each other. We had a showmance, as we call it, and in the business. And it was a huge cast, and it took us a while to get to know everybody. But there was a guy in the cast. His name was David Hilder, who's now a playwright in New York. And one day, he was younger than me. He's about 10 years younger than me. And one day, we were sitting in the green room, and I asked him what most actors do. I said, "So what do you do when you're not working?" And he said, "Oh, I narrate audiobooks." And I thought, oh, that's sort of cool. What is that? Not that I was really, on fire to do them. I didn't even know what an audiobook was at that point.
Right.
I had a vague idea. But so sitting down over a cup of coffee, he sort of gave me an outline of what it was that a narrator did and the profession. And I was like, wow, that sounds like a cool gig, for a performer. Mm-hmm. And he said, yeah. He said, if you ever get down here, give me a holler. I can introduce you to some people. Well, sure enough, 2 years later, Shannon had lured me away from New York City with her feminine wiles, and I started my career, my life over in D.C., and so I looked him up, and he introduced me to a man named Grover Gardner, who's a very well-known and respected narrator in our profession. He also is a casting director for Blackstone Audio. And so Grover went over to his house, and people ask me, why did you get into audiobooks? Did you want to have the thrill of narrating? And I said, no, I was tired of hanging sheetrock in between acting gigs.
Yeah.
So I went over to his place and I met Grover, and he's quite the character, really nice guy. We're still friends. In fact, I spoke with him this evening. He called me up. He lives in Oregon with his wife and daughter, and so we made a demo, and Grover shopped it around for me. And this is how back in the day it was. My first 2 clients were Blackstone Audio and Books on Tape. I just started working for them, and they started sending me material. And initially, I was doing things like Robert Heinlein, Starship Troopers, and O. Henry's stuff, and that was really the start of it. And initially, I was doing maybe 1 or 2 books a month. But over the years, I was still doing lots of television and film and theater. But as the years progressed, I kept getting more and more audiobook work and more nonfiction, which is, frankly, it's much more difficult to narrate than fiction. I know you don't have the funny voices and all the dialogue, but trust me, if you're a narrator, the agreement's pretty general that nonfiction is much more difficult to make entertaining than fiction is. And so and then slowly over time, I went full-time as a narrator. So by, say, 2000, I was working, at a pretty steady rate, and still doing a lot of fiction, but more and more nonfiction. And
did you have time then in those days to listen to other audiobooks?
Oh yeah, I was fanatical. Well, yeah, I mean, back in the day, there was no Facebook to have groups where you could talk about what you do.
Right.
And there weren't any chat rooms for us, so I learned on the job. I mean, that's my classical theater training really saved me. I tell people it took me about 30 to 40 books to become a narrator, to really understand what the hell I was doing.
Yeah.
It's a lot more difficult than people think it is. It's so much more difficult.
Yeah.
It's not only there's a video I have on my YouTube channel called So You Want to Be an Audiobook Narrator, and in it I tell people there's a little test, because I get contacted at least 3 times a week by people from all over the world, which blows my mind. But where English is a second language. I mean, like everywhere from Cairo, Egypt, to Nairobi, Kenya, to Beijing, to, I mean, you name it.
Yeah.
It's crazy. And so anyway, the video basically says, if you're interested in doing this, pick a book up, go sit in a closet and read out loud for 3 hours a day for 2 weeks straight, and see if you still want to do it. And that usually takes care of about 99% of the people who contact me.
Oh, interesting.
Because it's not so much a talent thing, it's a temperament. Can you sit by yourself in a little box, directing yourself, and stay on a project and stay focused on top of it? Because you can't mumble your way through this stuff, or you're not going to have any work. Your Audible reviews are going to be all 1 star, and no one's going to hire you.
Right. So there's kind of a correlation here with the Pale King, maybe. I'm not sure if you've read the Pale King, Sean, but all the IRS stuff about boredom and just levitating at your cubicle, all that stuff.
Yes, exactly.
There's a correlation here.
Yeah, it's in a general sense. Yeah, I mean, it's it's very zen. You have to stay in the moment, but you're also, when I shut the door to record, I'm wearing 4 hats at once. I'm the narrator performing, I'm the director directing, I'm the engineer making sure the recording is good enough, and I'm the producer making sure it comes in on time. Right. And those are a lot of hats to wear, and that has nothing to do with my performance, but everything to do with my performance. And so I tell people, you may think that this is, I get stuff people tell me I have a really great voice. I'm like, that's wonderful, but that that has nothing to do with telling a story, nor does it have to do with the reality of being in the trenches, actually sitting here recording a book, and what that actually takes. Now, granted, I mean, I don't want to make it sound like I'm working in a coal mine or something, but
just really sacrificing for the human. For the human race
I'm not going to have like miner's lung when I finish, but by the time I finish, I mean, I narrate 2 finished hours of material a day in 2 separate sessions. I work 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the evening. I also teach for 3 hours a day. I teach narration technique to students around the country. Actually, in Canada, I have a new student in Buenos Aires. I have students in the UK.
Oh, cool.
On Skype. And so by the time I do all that, at the end of the day, I am talked and thought out. All I want to do is have a glass of wine and watch things blow up on TV,
How well is he in?
We appreciate you sharing your wine time with us tonight.
That's right.
It's very generous.
Yeah, it was either you or watching things blow up, and I thought, what the hell? I just.
Well, I appreciate that very much. And, you know, when you're talking here, I'm thinking of the timeline. You mentioned the year 2000, and by that point, you know, Infinite Jest had been out for 4 years.
Yeah.
And I remember buying some like Stephen King audiobooks in the late 90s. It's some John Updike audiobooks, but I don't think anyone at Little Brown had considered making an audiobook of Infinite Jest for years. I assume it was just written off there.
Oh, yeah, it's a huge project. It's a lot of money to make. People don't realize how much money it takes to do a regular audiobook. You know, it's several thousands of dollars, and you don't recoup those unless it's an A-list title. It's more of an investment. It's like investing in a stock.
Right.
You know, I've done books that it might take several years. Well, the Abraham Lincoln book, that's going to take years. It may be even now it's only finally starting to break even. And I did that book 10 years ago.
Wow.
You know, and so it's also, it sort of feels in a way like Hollywood, where they have what they call big tent movies that support all the little projects around them. So you have like the Suicide Squad that's going to make $1 gajillion, or Star Trek or Star Wars, and those profits help fund the smaller movies they want to make anyway, that either break even or make a little tiny money or might even lose money.
Yeah.
And audiobooks are like that. You build a catalog of stuff. And so anyway, so I've been narrating for quite some time. I've done just about every genre you can imagine, which was fun, you know, and challenging. I like the challenge of it. And then around, I'm going to say around 2008 or 9, Grover mentioned me to a man named John McElroy, who's an audiobook producer. And out of the blue, I got a phone call from him one afternoon. And we spent we must have spent an hour or two just talking about everything, politics and kids and religion and you name it. And then toward the end, he said, I think I have a project in mind for you. He said, I'm waiting on a green light for it, and you'll have to audition, but I think you'd be right for it. I'm like, okay. He said, it's called Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace. You ever heard of it? I'm like, nope. And he said, you know, because like I was saying to you guys before that we started, that, you know, I narrate now. By that time, I was narrating a book a week, or more, you know. And when you narrate a book a week, it's like you're only focused on the book you're recording and the book you're prepping.
Yeah.
And you just don't have a lot of headspace. You know, people ask me, like, what do you read for fun? I'm like, I don't. I don't. I'm serious. I don't read for enjoyment. I'm always reading for work. Although there is a weird thing that's developed over the years, is that if I go on vacation and I'm away from my studio for like more than 2 days, I physically have to read something. I don't care if it's a cereal. It might be a cereal box, but I've got to read something.
Out loud.
Well, not necessarily out loud, just read something.
Okay, yeah.
You know? And
your brain expects the input.
It does. It's addictive. It's really addictive, because when I'm in that mode, it's very much like the psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi calls flow. You get into a state of flow with the work. And it's these endorphins get released in your head, and you're in a happy place. And
can you say that again, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi?
It's Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. He's a Hungarian psychologist or sociologist out of University of Chicago.
Oh no, the name is in Infinite Jest, actually.
Yes, I know. I've said his name so many times. It's so funny.
I've just never heard anyone say it out loud. So I was relishing that.
Oh, that's funny. I gave a talk at the Wallace conference on Mario, and I gave the quote about Barry Loach where he shakes the fuliginous hand. and I actually looked that word up pronunciation-wise last week before the conference, and just listened to it over and over and practiced it, and I actually put a phonetic spelling in my conference paper that I read just so that I would remember how to say that word. So the practicing of words that don't come necessarily easily, or ones you don't hear very often, is kind of a funny phenomenon, and I'm sure you hit that a lot with Infinite Jest.
Welcome to my world. Well, if any book, you know, that's one of those challenges that I'm doing a book right now about a man named Cliff Cates, who was a very famous Marine in World War I, who eventually became commandant of the Marine Corps after World War II. and his battlefield experiences. So I'm loaded up with all of these French towns and names, and I can't pronounce them like, Maurice Chevalier, like, ho, 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 blah, 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 blah. You have to, which was a challenge in Infinite Jest because of Marat.
Yeah. All the Quebecois.
Then the Quebecois, I had to do, and I can't speak French to save my life. I can do it phonetically,
right.
And I can read it. I can sort of read it, and that was probably the biggest. When I finally got the text, and I wrote John, I said, "Did I piss you off? Is that why you gave me this book to do all this damn French?" And it was so painful because, the le. And la, all those, the little things, and you're just like, oh, Jesus. Photon Roland, and you, and then, of course, the accent. But so you're challenged all the time with naming, saying things that you don't know how to pronounce, and you have to make it sound as if it just rolls off your tongue.
It has to be authoritative, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You cannot stumble through it at all, or it doesn't sound right.
Yeah.
And that's why that French, when they're, when all the French in there, it was just such a bear. I swear to God, every single French phrase you hear in there took at least 5 takes to get, easily.
Yeah, I bet.
Easily.
So the book, Infinite Jest, is 56 hours.
Yep.
What does that look like on your end in terms of recording and re-recording and doing takes? How many hours of actual recording do you think that ended up being, like before you cut it all together?
There's a kind of editing you do when you're narrating a book. It's called punch and roll. Mm-hmm. And if you think back to the days of tape, right, like back in the 60s and 70s when they used to record records on tape. Yeah. So if they'd lay like a band, so if you'd lay down the drums and the bass, and now you're going to come in with the rhythm guitar. So you have the headphones on and you're listening to the music, and just before you come in, the engineer hits record and the magnetic spinning head punches into the recording and rolls forward with your layer of it, right? Mm-hmm. So it's the same idea. So when I'm narrating, I'll record until I screw up and then stop, then back up a few seconds, like 5 seconds or 10 seconds, hit play, roll forward until I'm for a pause, and then hit the record button. So I punch in and then roll forward. So it's an additive process. Right? So what you do is you have what's called a work to finished hour ratio. So my general ratio is 2 to 1. Wow. So on that book, though, it was a little longer because of like the French and the formulas and also because of dialogue. Dialogue is always more complex than nonfiction because you want it to sound, you have character voices. You want the dialogue to sound naturalistic. So I'm going to guess that it was actually more like 3 to 1. So that, let's say it's 60 hours. So that's 180 hours of actual jabbering away in the booth.
Yeah. Huh.
And you broke it into chunks, right? You didn't do this in 1 month.
So what happened with John was he said, okay, I've got this book. He said, it hasn't been greenlighted yet, but in the meantime, let's do a couple of books together to get the feel for each other. I'm like, okay, that's fine. So we did a couple of books to get to know each other. I'm fortunate that at that point in my career, if I don't like to work with somebody, I can pass on something. But John's a great guy, and we got along really well. And then from that conversation, it took us 9 months to get the final green light from Hachette, and then 3 more months before we actually started. And in those 3 months, they actually mailed me the text. They took the text and they actually printed it up on 8.5 by 11 paper. All in that form, it was over 2,000 pages long.
Wow!
And it was loose leaf, and so this huge box arrived at my house, and
like
by
a
that
bomb.
time,
It's
yeah,
like
it
a
was.
bomb going
It was huge. Now, granted, I'd read the book by that time.
Okay, so
I like just bared. I just bared down and read the damn thing cover to cover, and I was really piqued. I mean, I was really hot to do it because it was so hard. It is still the hardest book I've ever narrated.
Yeah, and the most rewarding, you said, as well in your Joy of Socks.
Oh, absolutely.
Interview, right?
Yeah, it was because it was well written. It was, and the characters are well drawn. There's challenges that for the average listener you just don't understand. That as a narrator are challenges in storytelling technique that are really complex, and they're things that I teach as a coach. Say for instance, I know I'm jumping ahead. Well, let me get up to speed here. So so we finally start, and basically we would do 10. We would work 1 week out of every 6 to 8. So we met about once every other month. It took a year to record the book because we had other contractual agreements with other books we were working on. And then it took me a chunk of time to prep the next 10 hours. 10 hours is a normal week of narration for me. And so I'm scoring the text like you would a piece of music, like breathe here, hit that word, lower your voice here, and making notes and all that stuff. So when I'm in the booth recording and John's Skyped in, directing me or whatever, and then I can sail through the session as quickly as possible. I'm not stumped. And I've done all my research on pronunciation, and all the made-up words he has in the text, which drove me insane. So, but when you get into the subtlety of it, it's so much more. Okay, I'll give you an example of something that the normal listener wouldn't appreciate, but that it's so apparent in the writing. When we first meet Ken Erdedy, and that whole scene when he's waiting for the woman to come in with the weed, right?
Right.
Okay, so that what makes that piece so wonderful is that it starts from literally zero. Where is the woman who said she'd come? She said she would come. She had promised, and it's very slow and deliberate, and then slowly over that whole scene it starts to pick up speed and get faster and faster, and yet he helps you, as a narrator, as a writer, he gives you a moment of respite because he has those little sections in there where he talks about the bug coming out of the wall.
Yeah. Right.
And so that bug acts, if you think of it like a car or a train getting faster and faster, what happens is you're going at one speed, like first gear for a while, and then the bug comes out. It's like pushing down on the clutch and floating for a few seconds. And then so when you come back to the story, you've shifted to second gear. And then you hit another one. You hit the clutch, you've closed. Now you're going into third gear. And so what happens is it progressively gets faster and faster and faster until the very end when both the door and the phone ring at the same time. And then that's the high point of the tempo of that scene. But I use it as a teaching tool with my students. It's an exercise in deliberate tempo. How to start from zero and gradually build your read tempo to 100% over the course of about 25 minutes.
I love that.
That's very cool.
That's something that most people would not, you're not going to get. And then there's another one he does when, oh my goodness, I blanked. Who's our cocaine addict? Randy Lentz?
Randy Lentz, yeah.
Okay, so that scene where he goes on his cocaine jag and he gets caught killing the dog and the Canucks are after him. Yeah. That scene is interspersed with I'm blanking on everybody tonight. I have his name's written down too. Well, back at the Enid house, right? When he's trying to get the people all inside and are outside to move their cars. That scene is really slow. Randy's is very fast, and so you have fast and slow, and the fast scene is getting faster, and the slow scene is almost getting a little slower until they collide when the two characters. Right.
Canucks, yeah.
Yeah, when the Canucks meet
Gately.
Gately, thank you, God. Don Gately. It's a really wonderfully done. It's very cinematic that way. You cut back and forth between the two scenes and they get closer and closer and closer till they collide. And that once again is an exercise in tempo control. So if you've ever been around someone on a cocaine jag, you know that they begin to talk faster and faster and faster. And that's the way those scenes go with Randy. And yet Don is deliberately trying to he's like pushing Jell-O, trying to get everybody out there to move their cars, and it's frustrating and slow. And so you're moving back and forth between those two tempos. And that's something that the normal listener doesn't realize and shouldn't, frankly. It should just happen. It should just wash over them. But that's the kind of stuff that made Infinite Jest so challenging and so rewarding to finally nail.
Well, and it seems like that's the sort of thing that even a beginner narrator wouldn't nail or wouldn't pick up on as well. No. And even this is another good reason why I think fiction is better read by actors in most cases than their own authors. Like, it's interesting to hear authors read, but because they're not professional narrators, they don't pick up on stuff like that, and it sounds very much like they are reading rather than, acting or performing.
Right. I mean, a quick story. Back in 1992. I went with my first wife, Karen. She was a writer, and all of her friends were writers or performers. And we went to this thing at the Delacorte, near the Delacorte Theater in Central Park. It was like one of these reading under the stars kind of thing. They had like 4 or 5 authors going to read their stuff, and bring your blanket and some wine and cheese and bread, and it was a really cool thing. I'd never been to one. And so they had like, I want to say there were like 4 authors, and the rock star of the evening, the last person was Tom Robbins.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. And
Nice.
so I had just finished, she had turned me on to, like, I'd read Jitterbug Perfume and Skinny Legs and All, and I was like, yeah, let's go, let's do it. So there's about, I don't know, like 10 of us who went to the park. And so anyway, they start with the least known authors first, and they're going to work their way up to Tom. And the first guy gets up there, and he was freaking horrible. And it's his own stuff. Right? And he was it was painful. Now, by this time, I was working off Broadway at a classical repertory theater, and all I did was deconstruct text and speak it for a living. But he was terrible. And then the next guy got up there, and he wasn't quite as bad, but he still sucked. And the third guy was okay. He was middling. And then Mr. Robbins came out, and he was amazing. Mm-hmm. He's this courtly Southern gentleman with this wonderful accent, and he had time. His timing was down. He was perfect. And so at the end of the evening, we're all walking back to our apartment in Midtown, and someone said, "Hey, Pratt, what'd you think?" And I said, "Well, it's one thing to write it. It's another thing to talk it." And they all just jumped out like, "Oh, Mr. Classical Theater." And I'm like, no, I stuck to my guns. I said, those guys sucked, except for the Robbins. Yeah. Those guys were horrible. Just because they wrote it does not mean they know how to perform it.
Right.
And the two, I read it. There was an article in the New York Times recently where he had this writer. He's like a professor of poetry or something. I don't know. You could tell he had an axe to grind. The whole point of his article was like, well, audiobook listeners are yearning for authors to read more of their own material. I'm like, bull crap.
Yeah, no, they're not.
No, they're not, because the two do not correlate. Right. I mean, you've heard Stephen King speak, right? Mm-hmm. You've heard him narrate his own stuff. He got that voice, I mean, I love Stephen King. He's good for a great scare, but his voice, would make you want to, it's like nails on a chalkboard.
It's not thematic for his content.
No, it doesn't work at all.
Right.
And there are cases that go even beyond that, where I think that the audiobook narrator or the actor can actually take a thing that's maybe not great literature and make it even better than the source material.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, well, it's ironic that as an established narrator, there are many and I've spoken with my colleagues who, we've been around for 5, 10, 15 years or more, 20, and that sometimes you get this backhanded compliment where you'll have a major publisher contact you to do an A-list title that's so poorly written, so you basically have been hired to make a silk purse out of a sow's ear, because they can't hand that off to a lesser narrator because that person doesn't know how to do that. It's like when you see a really great actor on a movie who has a little tiny part, and they take that little tiny part and make it something amazing, like Alec Baldwin in Glengarry Glen Ross when he played the real estate guy from the corporate office. Oh yeah. I mean, he was so good in that he got a nomination for an Oscar. I mean, if you get a really talented actor can take a little tiny part and just make it into amazing, and you get so sometimes as a narrator we get books that are crappy, but they're going to sell a ton, and so they need us to rescue the material, as it were. So yeah, that does happen on a regular basis.
And there are some writers, I think, who are, their voice works better with their material. But Wallace, his material that I've heard him, he recorded the audiobook of Brief Interviews
and
with
Consider
Hideous
the
Men.
Lobster as well.
And Consider the Lobster. But in both cases, or at least in Brief Interviews, not the full thing. Like, it's not an unabridged, it's abridged.
Oh, yeah, well, it's exhausting. They don't realize what they're getting into.
Well, and I think that even technically there were some things in there. It's just like they just couldn't figure out a way to do it, because he played with the text on the page so much that it would be almost incoherent in some cases to try to read it out loud.
Well, we had an issue that John and I sort of locked horns on about all the abbreviations that are in the text.
Right.
Yes.
And what I teach and what I do, especially with nonfiction, is there's a misconception nonfiction especially, that the narration is a verbatim recitation of the text, and it's not. It's 99% the same, 99.9 in fact, but you tweak it all the time. So, you don't say in the quote above, you say in the previous quote. Right. Or you don't say, now the reader will hear, you don't say, no, it's the listener. And so one of the things you deal with all the time are things like, like when you run across an acronym, okay?
Yeah, like O-N-A-N.
Well, yeah, or whatever. Well, so if you have an acronym, let's say it's NATO, right? You never assume the listener knows what the acronym means. So you would say, and then in 1986, NATO, which is an acronym for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, blah, 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 blah. You always insert that. So and when I make a change in the text, I go by two touchstones. One is author intention, and the other is listener comprehension. So if my proposed change satisfies both of those things, I'll do it. I'll just do it. And so we had this issue that John and I sort of wrestled with all the abbreviations. And I said, John, you have these diehard fans that are going to know what HH stands for, or ONAN, or whatever. And sometimes you can, once you establish it, especially like an acronym, then you can just say NATO. But some of these are so weird, and like saying HH all the time, it didn't flow well, and it felt confusing. And the minute a listener goes, huh? And they're out of the story, you've failed. And so my go-to option, almost 90% of the time for that book, was to say headmaster's house, or what did you do for HH, or others like it.
Right.
And that's so subtle. I don't know that most, even hardcore fans would notice that.
Yeah, yeah, that's true.
I think it's more of a difference. There are some other things in the text. Obviously the big one is endnotes, and I want to get to that.
Oh, sure.
After this, but
yeah.
Even what some scholars would call paratext. Like at the beginning there are some chapters, even though none of the chapters in the book are numbered, there's some chapters that have the little moon circle symbol at the top. Was that even on the script that you got? That little thing?
No, they decided not to. There was no way to verbalize that.
Right.
There's a concept that I teach my students called the 4 voices of nonfiction. And I say that you have different voices or characters when you're looking at nonfiction, so the listener can subtly pick up when you're talking, oh, that's a chapter heading. Oh, I see. Now he's laying out the intellectual argument. Oh, no, that's a comment. Oh, he's quoting something. And you do different things to your voice, like characters. They really are like 4 different characters. But sometimes you run across stuff, just like, there's nothing I can do that would verbalize a symbol. So those I know what you're talking about, but those were just they were just taken off the text. That was out of my hands before I got the text.
And I mean, the bigger question there is like, Wallace was big into playing with all the elements of a book. He loved the copyright page and the dedication page, and anywhere where he could muck around and kind of put his stamp on it, he did. But I'm curious, like, where do you think that leaves audiobooks when they don't really have this thing? Like, are there other sort of paratextual elements that audiobooks do have that, you've kind of mentioned some of the subtle things, like what were some of the other kind of subtle things that you had to hash out about, taking care of this book? Well,
we had instances, generally speaking, an audiobook is it's a slightly different, no, it is, it's a different animal than the written text. Yeah. It just is. Okay, we do things like we don't do you can argue that any book we do is not unabridged because we don't do the table of contents.
Right.
We never do the acknowledgments because, frankly, listeners don't give a damn about your great, that long list and your great Aunt Mildred and your first football coach and they don't care. They want the story.
Yeah.
That's what they want. Here's The Secret of the Magic Cell Phone by Gus Johnson, Chapter 1, and you're off and running.
Yeah, because they're in their car, they have a 10-minute drive. Right. They just want, give me 10 minutes of story. Yeah.
Right, they want to be entertained,
And I got to say there was a choice made in an audiobook of David Foster Wallace that it does annoy the crap out of me for it's both Flesh and Not, which is a nonfiction collection of essays. And in the book, they had interspersed some of his word notes. Like, he just kept all of these lists of words that he wanted to use in his writing. and they took, I mean, this is thousands of words or hundreds of words, and they just put those words in their definitions as sort of filler between the essays, which works fine because you can skip it in the book very easily.
Right.
But in the audiobook, they read all those words, and it just feels like you almost got ripped off. Like no one wants to listen to 5 minutes of just a list of words.
Well, that actually leads into the concept and the whole kerfuffle around the endnotes.
Yeah.
Right.
See, so when we were discussing the project, and I remember talking to John about this, I said, "What do you want to do with these endnotes? They're sort of funny." He said, "We're not doing them," and he said, "That's from higher up," and I agreed at the time. I still agree, because here's why. Because for a couple of reasons. First of all, if you're going to jump out of the story, which is complex enough as it is, shall we all agree?
Yeah, for sure.
Right, which is hard enough to follow at times as is.
Yeah.
To jump out to these endnotes, and some of them are really funny and interesting, and others are just like ibid this and blah blah blah. And
yeah, right.
You jump in. When I let me digress again within my digression. When I teach my students, and I say, when you have appendix and footnotes, you have to decide, are you going to do some, none, or all? And my usual go-to option is none, because in a regular book, in a regular piece of nonfiction, and I say, the reason why is that if the book is well written, it should end on a really strong the end kind of feel. And then if you've got like 3 or 4 appendix where you have like a long rambling interview with somebody and a book of websites to go to, no one's going to give a crap about that,
Right. Yeah.
And so I almost never do those unless I think, well, no, that works. That one actually adds some value. I'll put it in.
Yeah.
And footnotes are like Harry Potter candy, meaning if the footnote is really interesting, like it's cinnamon flavored, great, I'll weave it in. But if it's like booger flavored candy, no, it's not going in.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But the problem is that there's no way they can weave these in, because the classic example is J.O.N. Condenz's filmography.
Yeah.
Which is by itself is an hour long.
Right.
So if I'm in that
you
thing
read
for an
so-
hour and you're trying to go to work and you get halfway through it, then halfway through the other end, and then suddenly go back to the story, you're going to go, wait a minute, where the hell are we at in this story?
Yeah. Yeah, there's a huge logistical problem for this book specifically with that, because the endnotes are so long in some cases, like 8 pages for one endnote, that the when you're reading the book, you have the luxury to flip back and remind yourself what the context of this footnote is or this endnote. But then in an audio situation, you're now like 45 minutes gone from when that little chime came in, or the woman's voice saying like 45. Right. Yeah. So how do you negotiate that for your listener? I mean, you can't. You really can't in this situation. So I appreciate the difficulty of that decision to.
But I will say a big but here. I mean, there's a couple buts.
Well, for sure, yeah.
The big but is that the book had been out for like 12, 13, 14 years.
Right.
And so it was not a brand new book. So you had people who had already read the book, and maybe they bought the whole thing hoping to get that filmography.
That's
true. Or to get one section. And the issue, I think, was that it had these fans. I'm just curious, did it ever come up like, oh, some readers who have loved this book might not like this decision? Or was it just like, it's a technical thing, like we don't know how to do it and it's not really going to work?
Mm-hmm. Both. It was both.
Yeah,
it was
certainly
both.
controversial that they were left out originally, right?
Right.
Because myself and a lot of other people that I know would argue that the endnotes are an essential part of this text. You can't read Infinite Jest without the endnotes, right?
Right, they are, but the technology is still not there to bounce back and forth. There's no way to do it.
Right, yeah.
And so, the original idea was we're going to record just the story, and then we'll have a PDF download of the endnotes for them to reference. Right. That was the original idea. Because because the endnotes themselves, so we released the book, and then there was great gnashing of teeth and rending of clothing for the David Foster Wallace fans,
right?
and really shitty, harsh reviews on Audible. And
oh man, I'm sorry.
Which is, and I'm like, okay, well, listen, I've been in show business for my entire life, and there's always people who are going to think something you do sucks, and people who love you, and people think you're okay. Those three groups always exist.
Yeah.
And But I thought, it's one of those things. It's like everybody has that. There's certain. It's like sports fans.
Mm-hmm.
It's like when you do a book. Like sports books are my least favorite genre to do. Not for the sport, for the pronunciation of the athletes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Because if you mispronounce the name of the athlete, or they think you have, oh my God, these people go apoplectic. They just go apoplectic, and and you can't win because you might have for instance, there's a very famous golfer out of France, and in his home country, his name is pronounced Dubisson, right, with a Gallic N that all sound in your nose. Mm-hmm. But in the United States, we either say his name is Dubisson or Dubisson, hard N. Well, I did a book he was in. I had to decide how to say his name. I had to pick one of those, knowing that I was going to piss off some of his fans because I, quote, mispronounced his name. Mm-hmm. And sure enough, that's what I got on Audible. So, we knew going into it that there was going to be some level of blowback. Yeah. And so, but that's not my control. I'm like the publisher, they're the one writing the check and they're the one thinking this stuff through.
Yeah.
And but from my perspective, I'm like, look, there's no way to integrate this technically into the recording that makes sense as far as the flow of the story.
Right. And
then, so the book had been out maybe, I'm going to say maybe 2 months, and all these, this blowback came in from the group, from fans. And then John said, "You're not going to believe this. We're going to do the endnotes." I'm like, "Oh, okay." And so we did them, and they were, I'm like, they were really fun.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then, but they're even so, they're standalone. There's no way to integrate the two.
Yeah, because you have to technically go back and forth between the audio files. When you get the prompt in the main text, you would then have to press pause,
go to the other book.
Go to the other file.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous, and so, I mean, the technology is not cut up with the way you would do it as a written piece of text.
Yeah.
And I appreciate the fact that was one of his styles, that disruptive reading style that he had. That was part of who he was as a writer. I understand that, and that's it is fun when you read the book to flip back, because once you get hooked on them, they're really fun.
Yeah.
To flip back and forth like that. But as an audiobook, that's why they're, like I said, they're two different animals.
Yeah.
And sometimes they just don't sync up.
I attribute that whole decision to Nick Maniatis, and that he got one of I think, as far as I know, he got the only advanced copy of the audiobook and reviewed it on his site, the Howling Fantods.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And he is definitely the most influential Wallace fan there is, and knows the people at Little Brown and Hachette and Wallace's agent and estate, and his review of it was basically, I cannot recommend this to my fans. And that was enough. He had enough back and forth with Hachette and Little Brown that I believe was what pushed them over the edge to go back and do it.
Well, my argument back to him would be, so we recorded them. Now, are you happy with what you've got, given the technology we have? Right. I mean, seriously.
I would say yes. I mean, for me, I'm not going to speak for him. I can't, he's not here to defend himself, although he was on our earlier podcast. But he, I would say yes. I would say, even though it's not a perfect solution, that it's better than just having the PDF.
Yeah, well, that's
like
fine.
I say, for me, I do, I don't sit down with Infinite Jest, the audiobook, to just say, okay, I'm going to sit here for 20 hours today and listen to it.
Right.
I sort of, like I say, I read the book first time 20 years ago. So I am more likely to pick and choose little pieces and say, oh, I want to go and find that footnote or that endnote.
Right.
So it's much more likely for me to pick things out rather than to plow through, 10 hours at a time.
Yeah.
One of my favorite, beyond the one that really always sticks with me, boy, I hope I don't screw this up, is the description in the endnotes of Blood Sister, One Tough Nun.
Yeah.
It's probably one of the, I narrate a lot of comedy. I narrate, through Blackstone Audio, I'm part of a small team of narrators. We narrate their magazine every month online, and I do a lot of articles that are comedic in their flavor.
Right, yeah.
And I do a lot of comedy, and that piece alone, I assigned it to my I had to cut it down, but because it's such a long piece, but it's one of the funniest bits. the whole time I was doing it, I was just chortling away.
Yeah.
And it's still one of, and that, and once again with his writing, there's that section toward the end when they're fighting in the office between her and the Mother Superior, and there's this one sentence that's literally a page. It's like I'm gonna say Faulkner. It's like one sentence of all this. She has these inner realizations about what's going on, and the iconography of the cross, and
right.
She's going to carry on the cycle of retribution, and it's one sentence. And I got to tell you, I worked on that sentence for probably an hour.
Yeah.
Just to get the rhythm of it right, and the melody of it right.
I'm going to go back and listen to that.
Oh my God, that was so funny.
Sounds good.
It made the whole endnotes worth doing.
That's great. And someone made a great comment to me at the conference last weekend. They said we just released the episode with Edmund Waldstein, the Cistercian monk, and someone said to me, Dave, you guys really missed an opportunity here. You didn't even talk about Blood Sister 1 Tough Nun with Edmund, who's a Cistercian monk. And I was like, oh no, you're right. That was the biggest mistake we could have made.
Well, there's that, and there's another one in the early one when the tough girl starts to get there's that long montage he describes about them getting to know, this whole montage of them becoming friends with the Getting to Know You soundtrack, and the whole scene lasts 30 minutes. I laugh having worked in film and TV on and off my entire life, that whole that montage is so classic. It's a cliche.
Yeah.
And when he's describing it, I remember working through the whole thing and just having to stop and just giggle like a schoolgirl because it was so funny. Because all those little bits, that they describe that he describes it, they're perfect.
Yeah.
There's so many, and people ask me that too. It's like, what's your favorite scene? I say, I don't have one. There's too many.
Yeah.
There's the scene. There might be the scene. One of my favorite scenes, one that has a lot of pathos to it, is the scene where young J.O. Incandenza is with his father getting the car.
Okay.
And his father's getting drunker and drunker in that scene. Once again, that's a scene about how do you modulate up the drunkenness of a character as they drink through a scene. It's a long scene, but that scene has so much pathos in it, and so much, and then there's the scene with Stitt having the early morning talk with them, and they're freezing their butts off, talking about pain, and then of course the. God, I could just go on and on. He's so, because of the length of the book, every character gets one really damn good extended scene.
Yeah. That
just with the transvestite drug addict who freaks out in the subway.
Poor Tony. Yeah.
Poor Tony after he's been in the library, basically shitting himself to death. Detoxing and everything. But they all have scenes like that, and they're so wonderful. And, I'll be honest with you. I don't listen to my own material anymore. I always tell people, they ask me, do you proof your material? Listen to it? I'm like, I would rather take a beating than listen to my own voice.
I feel the same way, editing this podcast, hearing it all back. I'm always just mortified by my own voice.
Yeah. Think about doing that 4 to 6 hours, and you're teaching, so you're just talking the whole time.
Yeah.
So there are very, very few books I will listen to, and I've taken the time to listen to Infinite Jest twice.
Oh, nice.
And I'm like, I'm very proud of it. It was so bloody hard to do, and we did it it took a year. It was so weird. I'd never worked on a project that was so complex over such a long period of time. Usually, I prep a book on a Monday morning. I walk in the studio, and it's like by Friday or Saturday, I'm done with it. And it's focus. It's off to the proofer to be, I get notes back a few weeks later. I record my fixes. The engineer drops them in. It goes through mastering, and then it gets released a few weeks later. But this one was just ongoing. And then, of course, with all the damn French that came back to bite me in the butt, it was so difficult. And I apologize. I would like to officially apologize to everybody who speaks French about how horrible my French was. I never claimed to be a native speaker at all.
I've been convinced so far, Sean. So like kudos.
How bad my French is?
No, that you do it in an authoritative and convincing way. And I'm a Canadian. I'm not a French Canadian, but I took French for like 8 years in school. So you're doing it better than I am, man.
Oh my God, it was just endless. It was painful.
Yeah.
Hey, did you ever hear Wallace read the Consider the Lobster audiobook where he did read the footnotes, but they changed the tenor of his voice.
Yeah, it was just
and made it sound really tinny.
Yeah, I thought that was weird. I thought that was a really odd choice. I didn't, you never know with some producers. You just never know what they're going to want to do.
And he had to do things like, okay, now we're back at the part of the text where I was talking to this
exactly,
one guy.
And that's exactly what would have happened had we integrated the endnotes into the story. And the decision was that was too disruptive in and of itself. Yeah. So I mean, there was, to be perfectly honest, I think that there was the endnotes with that book were a no-win situation. Nothing we would have come up with would have been a perfect fit to make enough people happy,
right? To keep the narrative flow of the book and to keep people interested.
And you see that is, I always, when I teach my students, I'm like, the first job of an audiobook, is always to be entertaining first. That's the first job.
Interesting.
So in fiction, that's easy because written fiction, its first job is to always be entertaining. In nonfiction, it gets harder because nonfiction's job, as it's written, is always to be educational or informative.
Yeah.
So you have to repurpose it. You have to make it entertaining first, so they stick around for the information. But the overriding thing for any audiobook is it has to be entertaining first. And if you start going back and forth with all of that kind of disruption of the narrative text, for the casual listener, think about the person, not the hardcore Wallace fan, but somebody who might have read something else he's done or heard about this book and wants to give it a try.
Yeah.
And if it's so disruptive in its it's like I actually sat down one time and tried to listen to Ulysses by James Joyce. And I couldn't do it. I couldn't get through it. Reading it was just a nightmare anyway, but trying to listen to Ulysses was so disruptive. And I just I give up. I can't enjoy this. I can't follow it. And I think that was, not necessarily that was their specific example, but I think they were afraid that by integrating the footnotes like that and having to reintroduce the story plot line would have been too disruptive for the casual listener. And that's what, ultimately you're trying to, you can't satisfy a hardcore fan of an author. You're actually sort of aiming for the novel, let's give this person a try listener.
Right.
As well. You have to meet, that's going to be potentially your biggest audience.
Yeah. That's interesting. Going back to the question of favorite scenes that you were reading, one of them that stood out to me as being really funny and engaging was the Seas narrative where he's with poor Tony Krause and they have the hot shots incident. And and so this also raises the question of the way that you perform accents for different characters or you perform like distinct voices for different characters. So Mario has a quite distinct kind of like mellow, almost pathetic kind of voice in a way. And then, Idris Arslanian has like an East Indian accent that you perform. So I was kind of wondering how did you guys navigate the question of how do we perform these characters? And was this a higher up decision? Was this a decision that you had to make as sort of, did you have creative control in this process? What was kind of the setup for that?
Well, I was given control over that.
Yeah.
Because by that time, I guess when I narrated that book, I was up to about 500, 600 books. And they're like, well, they trust me to make the right choice. But I have there's what I do and what I teach about voices is a 3-tiered method of coming up with a voice. So the first tier is when you're reading the text, you're looking for any kind of descriptions about the character. So let's say it says the man is a 55-year-old man from Georgia who chain smokes cigars and is very aggressive. So you got a voice like that comes out of you when you talk him like that, Other times you're looking for clues like Idris, the East Indian kid. It was just his name. And then you look at the syntax of the language, and then you begin to talk like, I must go to the bathroom, you see, because that is where I must be going. Because that's the language. That's the way it's written. Right? So it's always about, it's the old thing we say about Shakespeare is like, all the clues you need to know how to play a scene in Shakespeare are in the text itself.
Oh, yeah. Huh.
You just have to be smart enough to pick them out.
Yeah.
So that's the first tier. You're looking for descriptors. That's the first thing.
Yeah.
The second thing you go for, if you don't have that, is then you marry up a voice that you think fits from a voice you know, whether it's a celebrity or a close friend. For instance, like I have my Ronald Reagan voice, which is great for like kindly old doctors and sheriffs and farmers. So if you listen to the opening scene, one of those old men at that entrance exam sounds like Ronald Reagan. Well, I see here that you've got well, we're just wondering about these drops and scores. And I'm not trying to be a perfect fit. I don't want you to think, oh, that's Ronald Reagan.
Right.
I'm channeling that general feel. Right? And so I have different I have different ideas in my head about people I know personally or that or celebrities or famous people I've heard speak.
Right.
So that's the second tier. And then the third tier is when you have scenes where if you have so for instance, if you have a scene that's got like 5 German men between the ages of 25 and 30, right? What you have to do in that case is you just give each one vocal affectation. So one speaks aggressively, one speaks slowly, one speaks happily, one has a nasality. So you just give them just enough of an affectation, so the listener goes, "Oh, that's Hans talking to Dieter."
Right.
You know, and so you go through these different that's what I do anyway. And so you make it simple, but of course you also have your cheat sheet. I have a cheat sheet of descriptors about every single character, and of course in this book it just went on and on and on.
Yeah.
You know,
that occurs to me though that I can only recall one audiobook that I've listened to that brought in women to do the female dialogue.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And I know that that's not feasible for most books. And I'll tell you, it was Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde by Juno Diaz. And it was fantastic. And it really, to me, it was one of those books that I thought was better. The audiobook was as good as the reading the book itself, and really was more entertaining because it had this sort of really performative.
It's like a stage play, kind of like listening to a stage play or something. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess when you have one voice doing other characters, like in your mind, you're aware of that. Like you're very aware that, this is one person reading multiple parts. And in that way, that's more like reading the book. Like, you have this voice in your head, and then you might modulate it a bit. If it says Mr. T said, this, or
I pity the fool.
Right. It's like, well, you can't read that and, not do it in his voice. Right. But it's still in your head. It's not someone else's head. So I guess, there's more complexity. My biggest takeaway so far is there's way more complexity to every little decision that goes into even normal book, much less a book, that's 1,000 pages long.
Well, yeah, and you have to, and then what you guys don't know is like, well, for me, like when I was talking about modulating the text, getting faster and faster,
right?
You can't do that all in one big long take. You actually have to break down the text into little pieces, and you just record little piece by little piece, and you stitch it together with the software, so it seamlessly gets faster and faster. Right. The other thing you also, what I teach my students is if you have a scene with more than 3 people, you actually don't try to do it like a puppet show, like I can't pay the rent, but you must pay the rent. I'll pay the rent. Right. You can't, because what happens is when you have multiple and of course, especially in Infinite Jest, because you have lots of dialogue that's not attributed.
Yeah.
You have to figure out who the hell's speaking.
Right.
And so what happens in those situations, for me at least, is I don't try to do them live, as it were, like if I was doing a radio play. What I'll do is I'll do one line, like Mario's line, and then I'll stop. And then I'll back up and I'll listen to it as Hal and then respond as Hal. Then back up, listen to Hal's thing, and then respond as his mother.
Oh, yeah.
But so what that does is it gives each voice more clarity in its own voice, and it makes the reaction, for me at least, more realistic. So I'm listening to it as the new character every time. And, there were a number of scenes, like there's one I remember there's that scene where Hal's watching the video cartridge. He's in one of the rec rooms and the girls come in and they all kick off their shoes. That was built literally line by line. That was not done on the fly, as it were.
Wow.
at least that's how I do it, because like I said, for me, it gives me it makes each voice more distinct.
Right.
That's why your ratio goes up with the dialogue.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because if you bounce back and forth between 3 or 4 characters, what happens is there's a little microseconds wasted going, wait, that guy's Scottish and he's the old Scottish guy. Okay. And then, wait, that's the young girl from Brooklyn. And the time it takes you to wrap your head around that, what happens then is you throw the rhythm of the scene off. In other words, the dialogue, like you and I, all 3 of us are having this dialogue back and forth, and it's happening at a fairly quick pace. But if I had to do that live and I get the rhythm off, suddenly one person answers a little slowly, and it throws the rhythm of the scene off. And you can't have that, because then it takes the listener out of the scene. And those are all.
You're thinking like a director as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. That's cool.
And it's. It's just something that I learned on my own. I mean, I'm up this Christmas. I'll have done 900 books.
Wow! Congrats.
Yeah,
that's a milestone.
And it's crazy. Mm-hmm. It's crazy. And but of the 900, I probably have only done 10 in a studio with a director. All the others have been me learning, listening, taking in my own experience, listening to other books, and learning on the job all by myself.
Wow,
and
that's cool.
Which has been great. I mean, the challenge of it to me has just been fantastic. The rewards.
Yeah.
Hey, since you've done so many, do you want to recommend us a couple that you think are some of your best work?
Sure.
Fiction or nonfiction, doesn't matter, whatever.
Well, see, in the fiction category, I would. I did a book that's just a beautiful book called Raintree County by John Lockhart Jr. It won the Great American Book Prize back in the late 50s and was made into a movie with Montgomery Clift and Elizabeth Taylor. It's a beautiful book, and its structure it reminds me a lot of Infinite Jest. It has a really interesting technique where he'll end a chapter on one word, and yet that word is the first word of the next chapter, and yet the word itself changes its own meaning between the 2 chapters.
Oh, that's cool.
It's a wonderful book, but it's a really interesting story. It takes place during the Civil War and afterwards in America. That's a beautiful book. A book by James Agee, which won the Pulitzer in '57, called Death in the Family. That one I'm very proud of. Searching for Bobby Fischer.
Oh, love that book and movie.
Yeah. Then it's nonfiction, but it's a great book.
Yeah.
I'd recommend. It's funny. I recommend Starship Troopers. We're actually in the midst of discussing whether or not we wanted to do a re-record. I narrated that book 20 years ago on tape.
Wow.
And we get we've been getting a lot of reviews on Audible saying how poor the audio quality was.
Oh yeah, we get those all the time at this show here.
Yeah. You guys don't have an excuse. But so we're actually in discussions about whether or not we want to re-record it on, which will be really fun for me to come back 20. I mean, that was one of the very first books I ever did.
Yeah.
Huge sensation too.
Yeah, it was great. It's a wonderful book. And in nonfiction, oh golly day, there's a great book I did called 25 Books That Shaped America by Thomas Foster. That's a good book. The Jane Austen Education by William Dershowitz. That's a great nonfiction memoir. Very fun book. And then you get into like real nerdy titles. I did a book called Captivology, which is about the science of attention grabbing. And it's a fascinating book.
I bet that was helpful for your work too.
Oh yeah. Absolutely. I did a book called Time Reborn by Lee Smolin. It's about a new conceptual idea of quantum mechanics.
Oh.
I tell people all the time, it's like you can look me up. I narrate as Sean Pratt, but I also narrate as Lloyd James. I was Lloyd James before I was Sean Pratt.
Oh, really?
It's a long story. It's a long story. It's not worth going into. But so you can find me on both of those genres. And I guess the way to also look at it is, what I love about Audible is you can filter my books by best-selling or customer rating, and that's basically, I've looked at both of those filters, and they tend to show up the books that I would also say, yeah, that's a great book. That was a good book of mine. But nowadays, for the last, almost 10 years, if I do 50 books a year, 45 are nonfiction now.
Oh, that's a lot.
I hardly do any. Yeah. I mean, I did a really good murder mystery thriller last year called The Scribe, which was a lot of fun to do. It was about a serial killer in Atlanta, Georgia in 1885. That was a fun fiction piece to do. A lot of fun character voices. And I'm doing a new series where Abraham Lincoln in the 30s for a while lived in Springfield, Illinois with Joshua Speed. And that's true. He was a young lawyer and Speed owned a dry goods store. And they lived together and worked together for about 4 years. And this author has recast that time period that they're crime fighters, like Holmes and Watson. And it's really fun. It's a great... So I had to come up with that Daniel Day-Lewis, Abraham Lincoln voice that's now become correct, that high, reedy voice.
Yeah.
But, but the ones I just met... Oh, Ben-Hur was also a great book I did.
Oh, cool.
Lou Wallace.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was way back in the day, too. That was a very early recording.
That's cool.
I'd love to have another shot at that. That's another thing, too. I know when the book is really good, when I go, damn, I wish I could have another shot at that. And I feel that way about Infinite Jest at times.
Yeah, do you?
I'll hear a section, I'm like, because sometimes I'll be listening to it, I'm like, come on, Sean, tempo, tempo, tempo.
Mm-hmm.
I'm always on my students about tempo, and I tell them, I said, there's a reason why on the Audible app on your phone, there's that little speedometer thing.
Right.
Most people on Audible listen to books at 1.5 to 2 times speed because most narration is too slow for them. And people are like, well, if I go too fast, they can't understand me. I'm like, no, they can't understand you because your diction's not good enough. There's always a challenge with it's like a scales. On one hand, you have speed, and the other side you have nuance and precision. Nuance meaning your performance, and speed meaning the actual tempo. And you always sacrifice one or the other. But over time as a narrator, you learn you can increase both. But ultimately, if you go too fast, you begin to sacrifice speed and nuance. And if you focus on speed and nuance, you sacrifice speed. And you've got to find... There are times when the tempo of a piece takes over and times when the nuance takes over. And you have to know the difference. When you're doing the Ken Erdedy thing, as he gets faster and faster, you're sacrificing nuance for the sake of the speed of his internal dialogue, which is what that speed reflects.
Right.
And it works.
I ought to offer, I don't know if you guys want to do this, I actually have a recording, not from the book itself, but I use for my students of that sequence.
Oh, yeah?
And I can give it to you if you guys want to publish it as a side thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I'll send it along. You can hear... you can hear how slowly it starts and how fast it comes at the end. And so then you'll understand what I'm talking about looking at the text and going, oh, this bug thing is a chance for the listener to slow down or the reader to slow down. And then we pick it back up. So I'll put it when I send you guys this recording.
We'll post it on our website.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a perfect example of tempo control.
How long is that, Sean?
It's funny. I want to say it's about 18 minutes long.
Okay.
When I do that assignment for my students, they have to hit my time.
Oh.
I force them to go because a lot of my students narrate too slowly, and I'm like, okay, it's later in the curriculum. I don't make them do it initially because they can't handle it.
Yeah.
But by the time they get to that piece, I'm like, okay, you have exactly between 17:30 and 18:30 to clock this one in on. And they look at it, they're like, holy crap, are you sure? I'm like,
quite
yes.
precise, yeah.
It's very precise. Yeah. I'm like, it forces them to get a head of steam going. And but to me, what you're doing there is that's all for the effect of the read. It's not willy-nilly. It's in the text. If you look carefully and you think about what's going down, just like when Randy Lentz is talking, he's talking about he's high on cocaine and he's talking to that guy who's walking
Bruce
with
Green.
him. Green. Yeah. And he's talking about his kung fu moves and everything. That whole scene, he's higher than a kite. And like I said, if you've ever been around somebody who's jacked up like that, they're talking a mile a minute. Those scenes took so long to record because I knew what tempo they had to be recorded at.
You're right.
It was a matter of being clear enough and fast enough at the same time. And it was very difficult, but it was worth it. And I thought the end result I was very pleased with. But getting back to, there are other scenes I'm like, oh man, I wish I could go back and hit that one again. I could have, I missed that joke, or I didn't quite phrase that correctly. And it was okay, but it could have been better. And I'm very few books I'm like that with, but that's definitely one. So.
Well, I got to say, Sean, I found myself in the process of listening to your read of Infinite Jest. Like, I'm just driving in my car and I'm laughing out loud, like very consistently listening to you read this book, because I mean the book's funny in and of itself. Obviously, it's hilarious. That's one of the things that really hooked me about Wallace and his writing. But your delivery on certain lines just cracked me up so much. Like, for example, in that section on C, you know, when he says, "And then we Ricky tick the fuck out of there." Like the way you said it with the character's voice that you said it in, I absolutely lost it, and I just think about that phrase over and over in my head all the time in your voice. so you just you really nailed it. Well, so
and I just want to thank you in general also for sharing your time with us today and really giving us kind of a workshop here and a little kind of mini class about narrating audiobooks.
The science of narration.
It's something that we, at least I know next to zero about. Yeah. So it's been extremely informative for me to get this from you. And, is there anything else that you've given us so much? Is there any kind of final thought you want to leave us with here today?
I guess the thing I'd say is I'm very grateful that so many people enjoy the book. I'm not sure if I said this before, but this book has become like, for me, it's like there's a story about Patrick Stewart when he signed on to do Star Trek back in the 90s, and that he just thought it was going to be another TV show.
Right.
He didn't realize he was signing on to this iconic thing that was going to change his life.
Yeah.
And in a way, it's like that's what Infinite Jest has become for me. But I couldn't have picked a better book. And then I guess the last thing I would say, just for listeners who are fans of audiobooks in general, is to take away from what I've just touched on, just in a brief sense, about the complexity of audiobooks, that it's a lot more. There's a lot more going into it that's required than people really understand.
Yeah, that's been made very evident in the last hour for sure.
And maybe they'll be a little more forgiving when they're listening to, granted, let's be honest, not every performer is great at an audiobook, but sometimes when you're doing something that's really challenging, it's just challenging, and you're trying to do the best job you can, and you're running up against people who have very firm ideas about the book. It's like, when you take that friend who read the book and you go see the movie and, oh, the book was so much better. Well, yeah, of course, it was the book.
Yeah.
Right. The book is condensed and complex, and it's your imagination. And now you're listening to somebody like me do voices, and you're like, well, I didn't think of Mario sounding like that, or so on. It's like, well, it's a lot more goes into it than people realize. And to honor the text can sometimes really challenge the narrator. And you try your best to try to meet that challenge. And sometimes you get it, and sometimes you don't. And that's part of being a performer. But I'm very great. I'm really happy you guys invited me on, and I'm really grateful to your listeners and for listening and being such a fan of Wallace. I think he was a great writer.
Yeah.
And I'm it was literally serendipity that got me this project, and I'm so grateful for that.
Well, I've really enjoyed this conversation, and like I said, I could easily sit here and talk to you another hour. I have more questions, but I will let you. I'll let you off the hook.
Yeah, we'll let you get to your wine and
do part 2.
Well, maybe we'll do a part 2. How about that? We'll see how this one We'll see how this one goes. We'll maybe do a part 2 sometime. Okay?
We'll do the endnotes to the show.
That's right.
Oh, that's good. I like that.
But
what a thematic rap there, Matt.
Well, only if we can get that lady go bing.
Yes.
Number 27,
45.
There you go.
Your identity online, people can find you as Sean Pratt Presents. Do you want to give us your website and Twitter handle and stuff like that?
Sure. You can find me online at SeanPrattPresents.com. On Facebook, Sean Pratt Presents. On Twitter, it's SP Presents. And those are really the only 3 platforms you can find me on. Cool. And then my contact information is there. And you can, like I said, you can find me on Audible as Sean Pratt, and Lloyd James is my other big name.
Cool.
Well, thank you so much again, Sean. This has been absolutely just so entertaining and illuminating, and I've learned so much about your craft, and your appreciation for Wallace is awesome. So we're very thankful. I want to give a special thank you to a friend of Matt and I's, Ryan Marnane, who's a Wallace scholar out of Rhode Island, and he does a lot of scholarly work on audiobooks, and he just gave a presentation at the Wallace conference last weekend about the audiobook, the role of the audiobook in the archive of Wallace, and how are we going to deal with this material. And so he had a lot of really good questions that he submitted to us just to get us thinking about how to approach this interview and what kinds of things to ask. So big thanks to Ryan, our buddy, for that. And Matt, where can people find our things online to get in touch with us?
We are at Concavity Show on Twitter and on Gmail. We have Gmail. You can Gmail. Send us an email. It's concavityshow@gmail.com. I think we're on Instagram.
Yep.
Concavity Show. We need to get a Facebook page.
Yeah,
Dave.
do you want to do that? I can rig that up. Sure.
Yeah, maybe we should get a Facebook page. We just got on Stitcher Audio. For some reason, we were not on Stitcher, but we're on there now.
Right. Yeah.
So we're on, I think, every other podcasting platform. If you want to just search for Great Concavity, you're probably already listening to this.
Yeah, that would be about right, I think.
But yeah, thanks again to Ryan Marnane, and as always, to Parquet Courts and Robin O'Neill.
Absolutely. Parquet Courts is actually playing in Vancouver in a couple weeks. I'm going to go try and see them, and hopefully they play Instant Disassembly. Maybe I'll get the live recording from them, and we can use that for the episode.
That would be sweet. They're our theme song.
Yeah, that's right.
Thanks to them.
Well, Sean, thanks again so much. It was great talking to you, and thanks everyone for listening.
Yeah, I think it was. It was somewhere, fucking Germans. They'll do crazy shit. I have a lot of friends. Listen, I have friends who are Germans. They're like, oh yes, we shall do the entire World War One in an evening as interpretive dance. My friend Dieter has written a score. We shall do it. It'll be lovely. And you're like, you're kidding me, right? No, we shall do it. It'll take 5 weeks, but we are ready.